Welcome back to All About Genealogy. This is our second episode, and my name is Leslie.
And I'm Marie.
And today I'll be talking about birth, marriage, and death records.
And we will be discussing how to organize all that information that you start to gather.
So, beginning with birth, marriage, and death records, this should be one of your first priorities, the birth, marriage, and death records, because before you do any more research, when you get these certificates, they tie in all of your relationships, all of the people that you found on the census records, all that research that you did, you're confirming it through birth, marriage, and death certificates.
It kind of ties everybody together.
Right.
You're sure you're researching the right family.
Absolutely, absolutely. So always get your census records before you go any further, and then do your birth, marriage, and death records. Birth records can include hospital records. You'll find the date of birth, the mother's maiden name and age, generally, and almost always the father and his age, but not necessarily. Sometimes the father isn't included on that, especially in really early birth records. And if you find it amongst the papers, it might also include, if you find the birth certificate amongst your papers, say you got a pile of papers from an aunt or a grandparent or whatever, and there was a birth record in there. It might even include the state at the top, and you'll see that if you order those records from the state. So one thing I wanted to mention is that birth certificates in most states were not required until about 1906. It varies by state, but there were some certificates that were actually the birth indexes, which listed the babies and the mother's names and pretty much the date the baby was born, the baby's name, the mother's name. There's not a lot on birth indexes. It's not like a birth certificate, but that's all you got before 1900, really.
And it's pretty inconsistent. But if you just take a few minutes and look, each state may have come up with something.
Right.
And they may have gathered that information and documented it.
Generally, what you see is a big book, a birth index book that has been microfilmed. They microfilmed each page. And, there's not a lot of room on that page for information. But remember, though, the baby will always have the father's last name. So, there you go. At least you'll have the father's last name, if not the first name. So, after you're done getting all those, the birth certificate records, you can go get baptismal records at the church. A lot of times they'll register the baby with the family on the church rolls. So that's another avenue that you can pursue. And just remember, the baptism date is generally not the birth date. Make sure that you keep those two separate. Some people make the mistake of using the baptism date as the birth date. Not necessarily true. So when you're done getting all your birth records, it's important to then move on to the marriage records. So most states now, I think, have their marriage records online.
I think the majority of them do.
Right.
Ancestry and some of the online companies have done a really good job about documenting and scanning all of that information.
Right. You could also go to the state site. Just go to, at Illinois, it would be secretaryofstate.org, and you can get .gov. I'm sorry, and it sends you to a link and to all of their databases. But I just want to say that on marriage records, there's limited information. But again, it depends on the state. So on a marriage record, you would find the marriage date, of course. You would find the name and age of the groom. You would find the name and age of the bride. You would also get the name of the officiant. Was it a justice of the peace? Does it say DOJ after the person's name? Does it say, pastor? You would also get the name of the church or the justice of the peace name. Some states list the witnesses. Don't count on that. That's very few and far between. Some do, some don't. You're very lucky if you get witnesses. And Catholic parish records may list the parents, may not. The earlier records from the Chicago Archdiocese does list the parents. Later lists, it's hit or miss whether they list the parents or not.
Yeah, and what I found really interesting in doing my research in early Tennessee records, there was a point in time when a man had to pay a sum of money, from what I've seen, $1,200 to commit to marrying a female. And it's kind of like making sure he doesn't hightail it and run after she's made a commitment to him. What was really interesting is that I actually found family witnesses documented on a couple of those on those forms. So don't automatically assume that because you're African American, that information isn't out there.
Right.
It's there. In a lot of cases, you just have to look at maybe another format of that document. It may not be called a marriage record,
right,
but it could be out there.
Well, and what a lot of people did too in different states is they just, for ease of other genealogists, they just went into all the state records. And what they would do is index everything. They would take not an actual transcription, but they would do an abstract. And the difference between a transcription and an abstract is a transcription is a true accounting of everything that's on that page. An abstract, you're just pulling the pertinent information, the really important information out. And so that's the difference between a transcription and an abstract. And a lot of people went in and abstracted all those books at the state level, and then they just put them online.
But I think one of the things that we tend to forget, all of this stuff has been put out online. But I'm still one for going and pulling the microfilm.
Absolutely.
Because sometimes if that information isn't all detailed on the document, if you're not looking at the actual document, there could be some notes on the back of the marriage certificate that, a witness or there were extra people who showed up. So if you can, and you have access to a microfiche or microfilm.
Right. I had an ancestor actually that for generations, there was a book listing the marriage records for that state, and somebody in the beginning of that one person's research named this gentleman's wife as Jane.
Oh no.
But then nobody was checking, really, you need to go back and check the original records when you're doing this. Nobody checked it, and it turns out 55 years later,
oh no,
guess what? Her name wasn't Jane, her name was Maisie Jane. The lady above that record with another gentleman, her name was Jane. So if somebody was following along with their finger doing an abstract or transcription, their finger must have slipped and they went up one line and said Jane instead of Maisie Jane.
I've run across that, and it's really confusing because you're looking for a particular name and then all of a sudden you've got a husband married to someone different.
Absolutely.
And that can cause a lot of confusion. So take a look at the document if you're able to.
Yes, absolutely. Go back and check that original record. Okay, so then the last thing that we should discuss is death records. They're extremely important. If you're going to get any record, birth, marriage, or death, trust me, death records are the one record that you really want to get. Because the death records have the person's full name and address. They have the address where the person expired. Now, if you're talking about before the turn of the century, it could be at a son or a daughter's house. It'll also have the wife or the husband's name. Were they married, widowed, or divorced? The mother's name and where she was born.
Now, the one thing that you have to remember is that since this is a person's death document, the person that is listed as the name of that person may be incorrect. So don't take it as gospel. I have found that people, I may go by Mary, but someone else may go by Mary Jane. Or I've seen just totally different names because the person who reported the death wasn't quite sure of the person's mother's name.
Right. Always look at the informant line. That should be underneath the mother's name and where she was born, and the father's name and where he was born. There's usually an informant line. And that informant line is either a relative, husband, wife, child, could even be a close friend or a cousin. Sometimes, though, it's the records administrator of the hospital. They don't know this information.
Right.
They might have written it down wrong. You really, really need to, to pay attention to who's giving the information. So pay attention to the informant line.
But one of the things I found that was really helpful for me is that informant name. Then that way it helped to solidify whether or not this was the right person.
Right. Absolutely. Because it could be a child or a spouse. So another thing that's written on a death certificate is the primary cause of death. It's so important if you're doing medical genealogy. It also might give a secondary cause of death. Sometimes even a tertiary cause of death. So if you're doing your medical genealogy, if you're tracking diseases through your family, so important to take note of that. It'll also have the duration of the illness that the person died of, how long the doctor had been administering for that illness, also to the name of the doctor. The doctor may have been a family doctor for a really long time. That's another way you can track family members. They use the same doctors way back when. It'll also give the name of the funeral director who attended the decedent. It'll give sometimes even the address or the phone number of the funeral home.
And if that funeral home is still around, then you may be able to get more information. Maybe there's an obituary that they have in their files.
Absolutely.
So pay close attention to that. That's one of the first things I do. I look at that and pick up the phone and
not
call.
Not only that, funeral home records are a gold mine. It tells you who bought the plot, who else is in that lot where the person's buried. Funeral home and cemetery records are just a gold mine.
But what you will find, which one of the things that I'm doing research on, is that my family cemetery, there are no documents that exist.
Right.
And I do know a descendant of the funeral director, at least the last funeral director for that cemetery. So I'm trying to get her to dig through their files and try to find that information out. Because we've gone there, we know who's buried about where, but looking for that actual cemetery layout is really important if you're able to find it.
And here's another thing too, you might want to contact the local historical society or the public library in the town where the cemetery is located. A lot of times they have transcriptions. Even though the stone is unreadable or the grave is unmarked, they still know who that person is that's buried there. They know exactly where they are. And some really kind-hearted people, sometimes when they find an ancestor with no stone on their grave, they go out and purchase a marker or a stone for that grave just so that person can be remembered. What a beautiful tribute.
Yeah, I actually know someone that has done that because she found out this information about this person and found he had no headstone.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was a really kind and sweet thing to do, so that that person's not forgotten.
Right. Also, to remember, if the person that you're searching for has a broken or missing headstone, and they are a vet, the government will pay for that headstone. All you have to do is fill out a form, send it to the government. The government will either replace a broken stone or place a stone on a veteran's grave that has no stone. So remember that. Also, too, the name of the cemetery and the date of the burial is also on the death certificate. So get these certificates because they'll help you to get names and dates, especially, add addresses so that you can look up missing census records, and add different, peripheral family members, because sometimes a family member will disappear off the census.
That's true.
Yeah, and you want to know that they didn't, you can't find them in the death certificate indexes, so you want to find out if they're still alive or not, so you keep looking and you just don't give up. I just read a really interesting article from Thomas McGinty, who compiled a genius list of all the states' links for vital records, which are birth, marriage, and death records, from each state in the Union.
Wow.
And what I'm going to do, I actually wrote to him and asked his permission, and he didn't get back to me. But I'm going to put a link to that article where I found it down below. So you could use that resource because it makes things so much easier. You know the exact URL to go to find your state's records, whatever state you're in.
And I can guarantee you I will probably be the first one to go there because you didn't share it with me before.
No, actually I did. I did. You just don't remember.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so now you've gathered all this information, and I think you need to make a couple of decisions. So first, what do you want to know? Because I think that helps you determine how deep or how wide you go with your family tree. I've spoken to a lot of people, and I've seen a lot of trees with 12,000 people. But do you really want to research 12,000 people? Now, and also keep in mind, we definitely believe in having source citations. So how much information have they really gathered over those 12,000 people?
Absolutely. You know what? I'm of the school where you don't even add that person to the tree until you've done all your research. 'Cause that way, you don't have to go back and take people off if you find out later that, there's something going on, that they're not related.
Yeah, personally, for my tree, I am doing all my direct descendants and spouses if they pop up. But for my first cousins, I am including them in my tree because I know them all. But I can't guarantee I'm going to get kids. Yeah. So for me, my direct ancestor line is the really important piece that I find is what I'm obsessed about. And the other really important thing is making sure that you have the right person that you're researching. Leslie and I share a family surname in our family. And we joke about it all the time because the one person on her side of the family is a different person.
Right.
And I'm not quite sure that it's really important to out that last name.
Right.
But you do want to make sure that when you're doing your research, like she said in the beginning, that you're doing it properly and that you have the right person by collecting those important documents. So let's talk a little bit about organizing your documentation. You want to be thorough and you want to be organized.
Absolutely.
And the one thing that you want to be thorough and organized about is that you want to make sure you're accurate. Let's eliminate those frustrations. How many times have you sat there and you've got a pile of paper and you get really frustrated and then you want to just put it down and turn away from it? Yeah. You don't want to have an organized mess.
Right.
And I can guarantee you that I have had that more than once. But the other thing is that you want to make sure that you can find your documents so that you can tell your story.
Right.
So let's talk about methods of organization. You have paper, and depending upon when you were born, you may have lots of records from the past that are all on paper. And then you may have a blend of digital, both thumb drives and records online. I, being that the age that I am, I have a blend of both.
Right.
I do like having my online tree, as I mentioned, on Ancestry, but I do utilize other companies. Family Search is another one that I utilize, and I do put information there, but I do keep thumb drives around, as I like to back up, and I'll talk about redundancy in a bit, but I do like to back up records onto thumb drives and store them elsewhere.
Right.
In case there's, the computer crashes at my house, then at least I have that document secured in another location.
Right. And God forbid there's a natural disaster, you really, really have to consider. I mean, some people will go as far as putting a thumb drive into a safety deposit box.
That's me.
Well, yeah, I did it with my parents. I gave them a CD way back when, and they had it in their safety deposit box. But it's funny because when people were first starting out, when Ancestry first started out, and this was, the snowball was little and just starting to roll, people would save URLs. They would save web pages to their favorites and say, oh, I'm going to go back later and I'm going to get that source citation. And then, one day they're running through their favorites, and guess what? The URL is broken, doesn't exist anymore. So you just lost out on something really phenomenal, and you're literally banging your head on your desk. Don't let that happen to you. Because when you find something, it's important to either print it or archive it, put it somewhere where you know that you will have access to it in the future.
Yeah, don't assume that link will always be there.
Right.
And I will tell you, again, going back on family history on my side, my family had a major fire and lost everything, and looking for a picture of my grandmother was one of the things that started me down this path. So don't be caught up with losing all your documentation.
Right. Absolutely.
So let's talk about our positives and negatives about doing both paper and digital. You have to determine what's best for you.
Right.
You can't just pick paper because there's digital stuff out there, and if you're doing any research today, you're gonna have those digital files. And make sure that when you do that, you know exactly where you're going to store that. So that thumb drive that you have, don't leave it on your key ring. You might lose your keys.
Yeah.
So again, make sure that that piece of equipment is, you keep it close to your heart and you always know. Most of my research, as I mentioned, is done on the computer, and by default, that information is attached to my tree, as I mentioned on Ancestry. But the nice thing about that is also my source citation is also referenced on that document.
Right.
So as I look at a birth record, I automatically see where that birth record, where it came from,
right,
where the original record came from, and I know automatically where to get my hands on it, and
right,
I'm not afraid that it's going to disappear.
Yeah, and you could also use that as the file name that you store it with. So that's another little trick that you can use.
Yeah, and I actually go one step beyond that, is I print everything out. My background, my professional career, I spent a few years doing continuity of business planning for a company, and I just like to have the paper, and I like to store that paper elsewhere.
I know how you feel.
And also, I do a lot of research on the go. So I keep a file folder, and I can grab it if I'm going to do some research on my mother's family, and I have all the birth records and death.
Well,
Plus,
we are not the Kindle generation.
No.
We like the feel of paper in our hands. We are not the Kindle generation.
yeah, and
By a long shot.
and the nice thing about saving things online, I personally do a lot of research late at night.
Right.
So I take my iPad with me to bed, and I can do research. And there have been times when it's 3 or 4 in the morning. So, oh, you better go to sleep. Because you just kind of get wrapped up and you start looking for this information. But with it being stored online, you have access to it.
Oh, many, many days my husband would come downstairs at 2 in the morning. Are you coming up to bed yet? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that could be a problem. It's helpful, I found, to set a timer. So you know when it's time to go up to bed.
Seeing with me, I just snooze it. And at some point, I'll just get rid of it because it'll drive me crazy.
You lose all track of time when you're doing research. You really do. You look at the clock, it'll say 10 o'clock, and then boom, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. You have no clue where that time went. You're just so engrossed in your research. So I found it helpful to set a timer. That's just the way I did it.
Yeah, but the important thing to remember that as you're trying to organize this plethora of information that you're going to gather, you want to make sure that you put it in a kind of a storage file. That's what you're doing. You're storing information, but you want to be able to file and retrieve it quickly. You don't want to have to go through files. I personally, and I'm telling you all about my method of storing my information, not saying that it's the ultimate, but it's what works for me. That I have a pink folder from my mom's side, a blue folder from my dad's side. And then I have page protectors, which are amazing pieces of plastic. I love my page protectors because, number one, it keeps everything nice and clean. And then I'll attach a tabby to it, and then I can actually write on the side of that and see exactly what that record is without having to thumb through page after page after page.
Right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's real important. Again, think of it as being a file. It's like a file cabinet, and you want to keep that organized.
Yeah.
So the one thing that we've been talking about, spoken about Ancestry. I mentioned Family Search. There are, as we said, there are a lot of places out there. There's Fold3, there's Heritage Quest. That could run into a lot of money.
Yes.
So
World Vital Records.
Yeah, that's another one that's really good.
Yeah.
But so how do you do this on a budget? The one thing that you want to remember or think about is check your local library. Our local libraries where we live have great research database access, and you could probably do the majority of your research at the library.
Right. I would say that our library has the best databases in the area. We have the most, actually. We have Heritage Quest, World Vital Records, Fold3, Ancestry. Oh boy, yeah, we have multiple newspaper databases as well. So, I mean, we're literally the best in our area.
Yeah, and when you find that information, again, you want to save that obituary if you found it online of the newspaper. So print it out or save it to a thumb drive. Oh, and one really neat idea is grab some change. I always raid my change pile, and I take quarters and dimes because I know it's inevitable that I'm going to make some copies when I'm at the library.
Right, and when you get those obituaries, when you get those pictures, this is a little off topic, but when you do that, you can also look on Billion Graves or Find a Grave. If you find that person's
memorial page,
post that obituary, post the death certificate, post those pictures so that other people can find them. Genealogy is turning more and more to convenience. Ancestry trees have more pictures, and death certificates and birth and marriage certificates. It's amazing how ease of finding things are exploding.
Yeah, I fully agree. And again, it's just about looking for the information and saving the information and sharing it. And I think making sure that you post it to one of those sites is really important.
Yeah. Yep.
And one of the things I forgot to mention, Leslie, if you're doing this on a budget, it's really a good idea to keep an eye on after the start of school sales.
Yes.
I go to Target and I clean up on after school sales. So binders, sticky notes, paper, pencil, I keep all of that with me. And I just go and pick all that information up, or those documents up, and have a good time with it.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, I love that stuff. All right, so the one last thing I want to remind you about doing your family tree is that you don't want to depend upon your memory. Put it down. Online, you can print up a tree and just kind of fill in that who's your grandmother, who's your grandfather, and great-grandfather, and so on and so forth. That way you don't have to try to remember that, and put it in the front of your binder.
Right.
And the other thing that I think is really important is also making sure if you're researching a particular state, print out the county-state map.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's the one thing I love doing, because then that way if it mentions Madison County and then there was a Sutter County, well, how close are those two counties? Could my relative live in one county but their land was in another, the other part of their land was across the road in a separate county? So I think that's a real critical piece of information. But be careful, don't let it get out of hand. Don't start generating a bunch of files and papers and not organize it.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's just be a good researcher and take a break. Just gain clarity about your research, because sometimes you just need to take a breath and figure out where you are.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that's about it for today. Please remember to click the red subscribe button. That's really important, so that you are aware of upcoming videos that we've uploaded. And don't forget to hit the thumbs up button for a like.
We want to know whether or not this is helpful. So the more thumbs up we get, the more videos we will record.
Absolutely. And please comment. Remember to comment. We want to know what you thought of the video. We want to know if you want to see more of something, less of something. Don't do this specific topic, but do more of this. We want to know that. We're doing these for you. So don't forget to comment.
It's important.
Right. And remember,
if you don't have source citations, it's not genealogy. See you soon.